Yep.
YouTube working?
We are live now. I think we might want to go a little bit lower. Do you think?
Lower?
Yeah,
Yep.
a tiny bit lower. Yeah.
Like you want to tilt it lower?
I don't know. What do you think?
You could also do like that.
Oh, yeah. This is better. Yeah, could you move that chair a little bit further? Perfect.
And we could also
Oh. Yeah.
like that.
I'm just gonna move this one. You can tilt it towards that one a little bit. Yep. How's that?
That looks pretty good.
Perfect. For me, yeah.
Okay.
To anyone listening, let us know if you want us to tilt it more.
Yeah. I think that's good.
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. Could you check whether Raymond has a right link? Sorry? Over here.
Oh, you got that?
Yeah, so just, I think my phone is on the right mode. Just, pop over once in a while. Yeah.
My father's in a 5-year-old. And they have. So they're starting to do that now. Building it into. So this is what they were talking about. I mean, you can't retrofit that. Can't. My place is 1999. Can't just come and put it in everybody.
Oh yeah. I basically stood outside someone's window and was like, "Let me."
I mean, it is like a without making it.
Oh, sure.
There should be one out. Oh, you can grab.
I saw some of this.
Grab. Like an actor.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah, it's very.
Now they're building the Sky Train along Broadway. So that's
God, you guys made it.
Yeah, of course. We're here.
Perfect.
Good.
Cool.
Are you studying there?
I'm hold on my degree. Helen. Hello. Oh yeah.
Everyone who's just getting in, can grab your attention. Definitely seat on the path, and we'll get started in a minute.
yeah, so this. I don't know if there were some of them were in
That's not like the one in no, but I think it'd be like here.
All right, everyone, it's the moment we've all been waiting for. So I'm very pleased to welcome everyone here on behalf of the Reducing Nail Suicide Cluster. It's been a jam-packed week for most of us, and it's great to see a few new faces here, and of course all the familiar faces as well. For those who just joined, my name is Trevor Jibbier. I use he/him pronouns. I'm a nurse and PhD candidate at BC, and I'm a student in training with the cluster, so I'm helping out with some of the events this week. And I'm joined by 4 fabulous panelists who I'll introduce in a second. But first, can people hear me okay? Can you get a thumbs up? Awesome. And I do want to start off just with introducing us and giving a few ground rules. But before that, I want to acknowledge that we're all gathered here on unceded Coast Salish territories, including specifically the ancestral occupied territories of the Musqueam people. And with this, many of us in the room and perhaps our day-to-day lives as well are really working actively to promote mental health and promote well-being in our communities. And I just encourage everyone to reflect on how we can do that in a way that's inclusive of Indigenous peoples, and that also seeks to redress injustices that are ongoing related to mental health and social justice more generally. Ground rules, I don't really have much. Just encouraging folks, please do keep eating while we're talking. I don't think any of us will take offense. Speak now if so. There's bathrooms, gendered bathrooms and a gender neutral one just way down the hall. So feel free to step out as needed. And what we're talking about today is going to be really around digital interventions for mental health for men. And I think a lot of our conversation will be fairly strengths-based, but some of our comments may be a little bit triggering or heavy for folks in the room, especially for folks who have had lived experience with mental health challenges, or perhaps have supported others in their lives, which I think is most of us. So with that said, please do feel free to step out as needed and check in with a buddy as needed. And I'm around after the event as well. But for the event itself, we're going to have about an hour of facilitated discussion between the 5 of us. So going right up until about 7. And then we'll have lots of time for questions from the folks in the room, and also from the folks over YouTube Live. That's what it's called. So welcome, of course, to the YouTube folks as well. And definitely pop your questions in the chat online as we go, and I'll keep an eye on that for the end. And for folks in the room, just feel free to make a mental note or write it down, and we'll get to you at the end of those questions. But I will pause there and introduce our 4 panelists. So on my far left, we have Dr. John Ogrodnichuk, and I'll ask you to tell you more about yourself in a second. And then Dr. Paul Sharp, Akash Asif, and Dr. Zach Seiler. And maybe, John, we'll go over to you first. And if you can start us off by just telling us a little bit about yourself, and what brought you to work in the men's mental health space?
Thanks, Trevor. Everyone can hear me fine? Yeah. As far as introductions, I'm a professor of psychiatry here at UBC and the director of the UBC psychotherapy program. I guess of particular relevance to this panel is that I am the founder of Heads Up Guys, which is a digital resource that supports men in their recovery from depression and suicidality. With regard to how I came to this space, I've been working with men in my private psychotherapy practice for nearly 30 years and working in men's mental health research for the better part of 25 years, really. And I suppose that work became more serious when I met with John Olive, and we really connected very well and had a lot of shared interests and passions. And for the past 15 or so years, John, right, we've been going pretty hard. And this RMS cluster that we've got is a culmination of not only our work, but the collective work, really bringing a lot of tremendous talent from all over the world together to really amplify and sort of elevate the work that people are doing and working collectively. So great to see everyone in the room, so thanks for coming.
Thanks so much for starting us off. And we'll go over to Dr. Paul Sharp.
Thanks, Trevor. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. So, Dr. Paul Sharp, I am a postdoctoral research fellow with UBC Men's Health Research Program, also a member of the Reducing Male Suicide Research Cluster. My background is more so in behavior change and working in men's health interventions. So I don't come from with a clinical perspective. I come from the perspective more so of prevention and community-based promotion, health promotion. So my transition into the mental health side of things really came about around COVID. Even with some of my own PhD work, starting to make some of those connections between physical health and mental health. And a lot of the guys that I was working with in that space were starting to recognize some of those connections themselves. And that's really kind of driven my research from there around how we can make that more palatable to men in general.
Great, and over to you, Akash.
Can everyone hear me? Okay? Awesome. So, yeah, my name is Akash. I work with the Center for Suicide Prevention. We're located in Calgary, and we are a branch of the Canadian Mental Health Association. Our goal really is to equip people with the skills and knowledge to be able to help someone consider suicide. So we are an education center. For me, a little bit about my background and sort of ties into the conversation today here. Stumbled upon the Center for Suicide Prevention about 4 years ago, and it was after I just got tired of seeing a lot of buddies dealing with mental health issues. Some of them different. So, for me, I came to the center and also helped start Lucky Up, which is a campaign focused on men's suicide prevention, and it's really focused around how awkward behavior. It's incredibly difficult to ask for help when you are struggling, so what can the community around that individual do? And we're trying to put together something on that community to offer help and provide that support there. So just a little bit about myself and kind of what brought me to the work that I do.
Amazing, thank you. And over to Dr. Zach Sadler.
Hey everyone. I have a weird accent, unlike these four. How you going? I'm from Down Under, much like John Olive, and as John 1 or 2, depending on the day, goes by. Very, very grateful to be here. This is my second time in BC. I've had a lot to do in the male suicide space for quite a while now. I work at the Moustache Factory over at November, and we obviously take men's mental health very, very seriously, but we always try to bring the conversation into a wider space where we can start to have these conversations in the light of day, where we can start to understand the importance that friends and family are going to play. And so my aim really is to bring research to the fore, is to make research consumable, understandable, and is to shine a light on all that is good and strong within men, and make clear as well as a clinical psychologist myself that therapy is not a deep, dark, scary place, but is something that guys can connect with, that they can begin to understand, and that they can have a really meaningful time in. So really excited to be here and chatting with these guys.
Well, thank you everyone, and I love that the shining a light on the good, and I think today we're going to shine a really bright light on digital mental health. And with that, I think it's awesome that we've got folks who are working more intensively in research and in intervention-focused work, and of course all the in-between. So we've got a great crowd here to get lots of tricky questions from people if they're up to it. I can introduce myself a little bit more too. I think because we're doing this more discussion-based. I mentioned I'm a nurse and a PhD candidate, and I got into the mental health field really drawing on some personal experiences with mental health and illness as a teenager, and of course supporting a lot of loved ones and community members through similar and different struggles. Then I got to work as a youth mental health nurse here at BC, at BC Children's Hospital, and also working in community health and mental health and substance use care in Ottawa. And I was really frustrated by gaps in mental health services and care when it comes to young people. And that's really what drove me to pursue graduate school. And ever since, I've been working in this space with young people who use drugs and young people who experience mental health challenges, often with a focus on LGBTQ youth, but not exclusively. And today, as we're talking about digital health, I'll get to share some of the work that I've done around COVID-19 and how people across the country have reckoned with COVID-19 and worked to promote their health and access resources like digital resources to keep them healthy and well. So looking forward to sharing some of that. For now though, I know we're kind of going to break off and do some back and forth style discussion, but to start us off, could everyone just give me a little 1 or 2 minute recap of the so what of digital mental health interventions, and for men in particular. So what are they, why should we care about them, and why are they important? Anyone want to go first with that one?
I'll go first because then they have to repeat the same thing, hopefully. And I don't know what your thoughts are, Trevor, but just shout stuff out, guys. That's relax. You know, we're here to talk about this stuff in an open, honest way, and so we're not the experts, we don't know all the answers, so let's have a back and forth, all right? But in my perspective, and definitely in Movember's perspective, you know, the way that digital sits within a mental health realm for guys is that's largely where they are. We know that you can put on various events, you can try to bring in sporting communities, you can work in barbershops like we have previously and connect with guys in places and spaces that make sense to them, but increasingly and understandably men exist in online spaces. And so if we think about mental health, it is obviously still somewhat of a stigmatized topic, and you know the confidentiality and the ability that digital spaces provide for guys to go on and seek information, like through something similar to Heads Up Guys, where they can consume and normalize their own experience without having to step out their front door, I think is a really powerful part of why digital connections are so important. And there's just a full gamut that you can have online. You can do it in so many different ways. You can offer information through video, through text, through whatever it might be, and it also is a great means for social connection. My PhD student Michael over here has had a lot of discussions with Reddit forums, and I always say that I think more men are getting therapy from Reddit than from therapists. So let's not pretend that we have the panacea in our ivory tower of creating this research, or creating clinical services and hoping they come to us. We need to go to them.
And before we go to the next person, I got a nod that we might be a little bit too quiet. Is this more for the online people, or? Can people in the back hear us okay?
Online people tell us what they're thinking.
I think it was just Akash's microphone was maybe a bit, yeah. But the rest.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Now sing.
Yeah, I think for me, I'll maybe answer that question a little bit differently here, just because with Buddy Up, it's digital assets that we are using really to promote authentic conversations among men and their buddies. So if you go to buddyup.ca, some of the pieces that we've been utilizing are, you'll go right there, you'll see cartoony looking illustrated characters, each having their own story. They're all dealing with their own limitations and warning signs around suicide. What we're trying to do with that, and I think it goes to the question around just digitally, is making things a little more approachable and things that can resonate with the public in general as well. So these cartoony looking individuals, I mean, suicide is a heavy topic. It makes it a little bit less sort of burdensome and a little bit more lighthearted in that sense. And then we also have a 4-step conversation about how you can help someone that we might be worried about. And so I think those are some of the assets we use. But I think where it really helps us and where these digital assets have helped us and just having this information is working with people from across not just Calgary or Canada, but even the world in that sense. So having organizations, individuals who are interested in learning more about the campaign, who want to become more involved. So it opens up a lot more doors for us, and it's really given us the opportunity to both provide resources, provide support, but also learn as well here. So something that might work in Western Canada, for instance, might be different from what we're using in Canada in that sense. We're also gathering information as well at the level there.
I suppose from my perspective, the digital medium is often a starting point for a lot of guys as well. Similar with anything in today's day and age, when you want to learn about something new, when you want to figure out how long it takes to boil an egg, the first thing you do is you Google it. So similarly with mental health, if you're starting to experience things that you can't fully conceptualize or understand yet, you might start to enter your symptoms into Google. You might start to, maybe it is men's depression that you type in. So making sure that there's relevant resources that show up, I think are incredibly important. That said, I think in the digital world and kind of digital interventions around mental health, as Zach said, the opportunity here is really limitless. And I think even just based on some of the programs that we'll talk about today, they take varying approaches, quite different approaches in fact. And I think we're really only starting to scratch the surface as more and more of the things we do and interact with are online. I think there's an opportunity to be really creative here in how digital interventions are used and designed to target men's mental health.
Yeah, maybe picking up on some of what Zach said, we can't neglect the fact that there's a lot of economies associated with digital space and digital interventions. We can reach a lot of people through digital work. It's cheap relative to TV and radio and newspaper, and we can't forget about that, especially when we're working with the small budgets that all but November has. But even then, the money's not infinite, and so we have to be very careful and creative about how we use that, and the digital space offers a lot of opportunity. And also the aspect of connection. We think, well, it's digital, it's just you engaging with your computer or smartphone or whatever it is, and that's not it at all. The digital interventions, resources offer the opportunity to normalize conversations around mental health, and actually to normalize help seeking, and actually provide the opportunity for people to help one another. You're talking about Reddit. People go on forums, and that's actually a form of peer support there, really. And people from all over the world can engage with one another, be there for one another, help each other feel heard and understood, which is really, really important. And it's not necessarily a replacement for person-to-person work. Sometimes that's sort of a stepping stone, like Paul was saying, to get to that point. But sometimes people, what they need is just to feel that they're not alone. Depression, or where you're dealing with suicidality, those thoughts in your head that maybe you'd be better off not here. Those are really isolating experiences. And when you go on to these digital resources or forums, and you hear other people speaking about having those same sort of feelings and thoughts, and it's like, I'm not the only one. And that's really relieving.
Can I just throw a spanner in, not as the MC here? What do you think from a proliferation perspective? Because that's what happens in digital spaces, like Cash, Buddy Up and something we've got called November Conversations that are somewhat similar in the way that they work. There's always that tipping point where it's like, how many do we need for it to be effective? And then it's like we're at 100 or 300, and then there's just too much, and no one knows where to go. And we're not sure what is evidence-based and what's not as well within a digital perspective. I think it kind of happens in men's groups sometimes as well in face-to-face stuff where it just blows up because someone goes over here and wants to start something new, and it kind of splinters the sector. So, how can we all work together to make sure that everything that is digitally oriented, firstly, is going to be used, because there's way too many things that have 10 visits, a year, and it's like, it just doesn't seem like a good use of funds and or energy. And then also making sure that we're not fighting for space, because there's enough guys in distress, sadly, who require this as well.
That's a good point, Zach. You're talking about the limitations of digital resources, too many, spreading too many people too thin, but also the potential. And I think capitalizing on that potential really relies on kind of what we're doing this week and today. People coming together rather than saying my boat's bigger than yours and sail past you. It's like, how can we sail together and complement one another? Because we're all trying to do the same thing.
I think too, another thing to consider is the amount of buy-in that's kind of picked up for digital health interventions over the years, and especially together with the COVID-19 pandemic. So we really have seen these taking off. And I think one thing we haven't quite touched on is the need to evaluate these interventions. So see what's working, what's not working, what's feasible from a money standpoint. If you're not November especially. And yeah, see who's not reaching these programs as well. So what else is needed, and what more can we do to support folks? So some really great questions there.
Trevor, you did a study that you looked at people engaging or not engaging with online resources. I wonder if you have any reflections about it. I do have some.
So the study that Dr. Gornichuk is mentioning is one that was conducted across Canada. It's led by Dr. Emily Jenkins, who's here at UBC Nursing. So check her work out if you're interested in getting all the details. But really what we did is we surveyed 3,000 people across Canada. And it's like a generalizable sample, so it's people who are representative of Canada by race, ethnicity, age, and region, and household income. So it's a pretty special study. And what we learned from folks is that, unfortunately, in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were quite high rates of mental distress. So a third of people experiencing what we call moderate distress, and 1 in 7 people having what we assessed as being severe distress. So a high rate of mental distress. And we wanted to look at what are people doing to help with that distress, especially when it comes to digital interventions. And unfortunately what we found is that there wasn't a big buy-in in digital interventions. So while folks are arguably have a need for the supports, they weren't accessing it to the degree that we need to go forward. Which I guess I can pivot to our other panelists here and say, or ask, who do you see us not reaching with mental health interventions in the digital space? And what can we do to support that and bring people in?
Well, I can start with heads up, guys, and just reflecting on our Google Analytics, our traffic, our engagement. And You always have to take what you get with a grain of salt because it's not perfect. But what we know through some of the analytics that we derive is that we capture sort of our target market. We made an explicit, conscious decision to try to capture men sort of on the younger age, adult men age spectrum. And we do. We get more than 55% of men who come are 35 and under. And although we get men across age spectrum, the older gens we're not seeing as much. Now, have to remember that data comes only from when people are logged into their Google accounts coming to the site. Those who don't have a Google account, or if they do and they're not logged in, we have no idea. So it's a reflection of some of the people, but not all. But nevertheless, if we say it's generally representative, we're not capturing older guys. And I'm not surprised with our resource. If you say you're 68 years old and you're struggling, you come to our site, and it's, you know, we don't have sort of perhaps the imagery, the aesthetics that might be appealing to older guys. And so, is it that? Is it that they're not in the e-space? I don't think that's necessarily it. For some it may be. Or do we have to have different messaging? We don't know. All we know is that we've got to do something better to try to engage with them.
I might carry on with that and just highlight another potential blind spot around the preventive mental health side. So for many men, the pathway to get engaged with resources is they are at a point of crisis, or they have had someone suicide in their life and they're looking to understand that. So how can we start to get men involved in this space from a preventive approach, interested in their mental health, aware of their mental health, accessing some of these resources before it gets to the point that, you know, we're ultimately in a crisis stage and trying to manage things from there.
I think if we're looking at who we are and are not engaging, regardless how big or small your organisation is, there are far too many men that we are not engaging with. You know, Heads Up Guys gets large numbers, November.com gets large numbers, but it is a minority of the population. So I think the people that we do not get in these interventions, and we discuss this a lot in my team, are the people who we actually need to reach. It's the same problem that we have with research. You put out an ad, all's going out at the moment, look at your table for recruiting, shout out, and what happens is that you try to recruit, and you recruit the help seekers. You recruit the guys who want to talk to you for an hour about your experiences, and in many ways, you know, the majority of these digital interventions are going to reach the guys who are firstly aware of what's going on for them, largely. I think Heads Up Guys is great because through Google and through Google search word stuff, if someone is really unsure of what's happening, Heads Up Guys provides you with the literacy to actually start to fathom what this might be. But I think that there are so many guys who go through the world under the radar and who haven't actually, you know, really grappled with what this is. They don't have the literacy to know, and they go on to a crisis point, at which point that is when paramedics show up, and that's when emergency departments are in play. The amount of guys that I've seen clinically who are extremely unwell, who have never had any understanding and inkling that they are mentally unwell, over a 10-year period of traumatic incidents is astounding. And so to suggest that we are even at the tip of the iceberg, I think is somewhat presumptive. So it's both heartening to know that we are reaching the guys who need it currently. There are guys who are like, I need to do this, and they find our websites, thankfully. But there is a huge swathe of the population who we want to be targeting in ways. We need to tell them that they don't even know what they need, which is a really, really hard concept. And we also can't go at it from a masculinity perspective. You can't go at it from a shaming or distancing perspective either. So we need to come at it from a, you know, we are here for you, and here is some information you may not have considered before, but you're going to have to wrap that in a way that is unique, exciting, and enticing, which all of those pose pretty difficult challenges.
Yeah, I'll speak to your question as well. I'm going to take it into a different direction. I tend to do that a lot. So I think I have two sort of pieces that I want to talk about. The first one is oftentimes, and I'll speak a lot to the Buddy Up campaign since that's sort of what I lead there, but oftentimes what we find is when it comes down to health offering, just suicide prevention in general, connection is a big piece of it. So on our website, for instance, there's activities that are listed. Easy, go there, activities, go for a run, play games with your buddies, send a text message, for instance. Like things that just build that connection, build that community. And I would say we're not reaching one of the limitations we certainly have sometimes are people who come to us and say, hey, I want to connect, but I don't have a buddy. and so that's someone that I would say, with Buddy Up, we have sometimes a challenge of connecting those individuals. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit was documenting sort of how many is enough or how many is too much when it comes down to resources. And I think what I want to point out and get your guys' thoughts on it as well is like, I don't know if sort of one shoe fits all in this case as well here, because the more the better is how I think. But at the same point, the reason why I think this way is because I think there's a lot to say about the cultural context and the differences between where these resources are coming from and how they're being displayed as well. So for instance, with Buddy Up, a big sort of motivation aspiration for us was through the Mason construction program in Australia. And when we wanted to develop a program here in Canada, we created advisory committees and we asked them, like, is there a word that's similar to mate in Australia? And we could not come up with anything necessarily. And that's kind of how we came up with Buddy. And so I would just be interested in learning a bit more about others' thoughts on this too, where Buddy Up, for instance, might work in North America, but it has suicide on it. It has suicide on the page several times. Are there other countries where it's illegal to even talk about suicide? So how is there a different resource that would be more applicable to them in that sense?
I think that working in different markets is a challenge for me. That's what we create videos in Australia. Our sense of humour doesn't necessarily travel in the same way. Thank you for that. But I also think that when it comes to title screens, we have a program called Ahead of the Game in Australia, which is a mental resilience, fitness, community-based sports program. We brought it to Canada, breaking the ice. We had to change it. We've got to totally wrap it in a different way. And I agree that you should consider cultural context and where it comes from, and that one size doesn't fit all. But I do think that if 10 organisations are creating interventions that are extremely similar, come from largely white westernised countries, and are aiming at the same population, I would love to know the effect that has on the population. I believe, in my experience with crisis hotlines, that they get confused. And I think that we need to understand where is the line there of how are we going to act. Because you look at psychologists in Australia, they have no idea where to go. No one has any idea. There's too much to do. It's the same with toothpaste. It's like, there's just too much choice. It's frightening. So I think that we need to find ways to simplify processes for people who are in high distress. And that is not to say, though, because in Australia the crisis hotline is Lifeline, and everyone continues to hammer Lifeline. 13, 11, 14 is embedded in my brain, and after a while, people start to get shitty with that as well, because it's like everyone keeps telling me to do this thing. I did it, it didn't help, and so that's where you want more choice. So it really does become pretty contextual, which I can see it's a complex issue.
I like that comment about simplifying processes as well. And one thing I didn't mention about our study is the most common reason why people didn't access digital mental health supports is because they felt that they didn't need help. And this is despite people, having very high levels of mental distress for our clinical and qualitative assessment. And this was like, you know, with men and women and then non-binary people too. But I think when we're talking about simplifying and tailoring interventions to context, we also need to be you know, destigmatizing mental illness and normalizing mental health. And many of the participants in this study, you know, held that view that, you know, maybe I don't have a mental illness right now, these resources aren't for me, despite still coping and struggling with a lot of the stress brought on by the pandemic. So I think, yeah, you taking a step back and saying everyone has mental health. Most of us or all of us are struggling with some degree of mental distress or social stress during the pandemic, and having that as like an initial point of contact with folks too.
Yeah, to pick up on the point that you just shared there, Trevor, you said a lot of people, despite having on the, you know, the scales that you used indicating severe, moderately severe distress and I don't need help, Zach, you brought up the point, there's so many people out there that are ill and don't know it, they don't recognize it. And we try to get to them, but it also points to the importance, the important role that we all have in supporting people in our lives, to be attuned to signs of distress and to know how to engage in support in a meaningful way, but also in a way that doesn't overwhelm ourselves. We're not supposed to be our friends and colleagues, doctors or therapists, but we do have a role in supporting, recognizing and supporting. And I think all the, you know, whether it's November, Buddy Up, Heads Up Guys, we try to do that. We try to arm the public, really, to be able to do that.
And I think we've talked lots about barriers and maybe what's not working so well when it comes to bringing people in the door for mental health. But maybe I can ask the group, like, what is working well or what's going well when it comes to digital mental health?
We all have jobs, so it's good. For now, my CEO's in the back, we'll see how this goes. But I think that what's going well, so the program Men in Mind that is up there is a digital intervention for clinicians. So it's not for men themselves, it's for the clinicians who treat men. And you know, everybody when we started this program was like, there's no way you're going to get practitioners to do anything because they're so busy, blah, blah, blah. And we created this and we put up a landing page and they just swarmed in. And this was despite the fact that there are endless continuing education courses that they can do online. But so many, like we've had, I believe we're at like 4,500 clinicians within Australia now, and they went on BC Global News yesterday. I was thinking of putting on an accent, but I decided against it. And I spruiked Men in Mind and the program, and we had another 100 BC clinicians coming through, which is really exciting. So there is so much interest amongst clinicians who I think are telling us that they are struggling to engage with guys. And so it really comes down to seeing those gaps and speaking with community, and that's when things succeed. And I think that whether it's Buddy Up or Heads Up Guys as well, it's seeing the gap and going, we're gonna build this alongside men. If you do it in isolation, if you do it separately and believe that you're filling a gap through some brainwave of your own, rather than actually going out and speaking to community, you will fail. We need to do this with guys and their supports as well, because it is largely often the mothers and the partners and the children who are doing much of the caregiving for men who are in states of distress. But when it comes to digital interventions more broadly, I think that they're succeeding in many ways because they are light touch and because you can do them whenever you want, however you want. And we offer them for free, which is obviously a very useful situation in comparison to the expenses of therapy. So I think that what the challenge is that we have, which is again the exciting thing, is long-term outcomes, is long-term follow-up, because we often get people dropping in for 3 to 5 minutes on something, if that, and then we lose them. And knowing the impact that has and making them come back is really the key. That's the key for social connections, and that should be our aim for digital interventions as well, which is repeat visits, coming in preemptively, before crisis hits, and knowing that there is a safe place for them to seek that information.
Anyone want to add anything about what's going well? Give us a positive maybe.
I'm a fan of Movember Conversations in particular because it is a skill building resource. I think there's a lot of interest in educating initially on websites, and I think the expected impact that we can get from that is only so much. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to move beyond kind of education and awareness raising towards long-term skill building, and that's beyond kind of the traditional educational model that we're used to. You have different mediums of video and podcasting and all these sorts of avenues that you can really hammer home messages that resonate with people in different ways.
It's self-betterment is key. The skills are so important. And I think we went through, and this may have just been a digital development, but we went through such a long period of time of just like, watch this video, and now you understand everything, rather than how are we going to have a back and forth? How are we going to get them to go into the world and try this thing, and then come back and tell us how it went? And so that is something that we should all be aiming to do, which is for it to be a didactical, but it's through practice, it's through action, it's through skills, because the age, no one wants to do that type of, here's a module anymore. And I think that us as researchers are way too trigger happy to provide those types of, because that's all we've ever seen before, because 10 years ago when our supervisors were leading it, that's what was created. We need to blow up the system and do things differently, I think.
I think an important point about that skill building is trying to appeal to what matters most to men. We don't want to engage with men and say, we're here to help put you back together, fix you because you're broken. That's not going to work. We're wanting to engage with men to help them literally feel like the best version of themselves, bring joy and positivity back in their life. When I meet with guys in therapy, I at some point will always ask them, what makes you happy? And most of them respond like this: I don't know. No one's ever asked me that before. But a simple question is really profound, and we need to be able to help the men not repair something that's not quite working. We need to talk about, Zach, you talk about this a lot, the positive aspects, the strength in many ways, strength to be more intimate in your relationship with your partner, to be there for your children, to be there for your friends when they need a hand. Those are the things that we need to do.
I think most of it's code. I think, to me, when I look at digital resources, I would just say just having a very clear and simple call to action. I think those are my favorite resources that are digital and online, for instance, in that sense. So what's easy, what's tangible, what's something I can do today, something I can break into chunks. I think that's, I see that with Everett guys as well. You can see, hey, this is what I need to do here. And I think that's helpful, because you're right, we want people to continuously come back. They are not going to be there for a long time, so let's quick, easy, accessible, something they can do right away.
Go in a different direction, but I think all of us can probably speak to this. One thing that's often talked about as being like a big barrier to seeking help is mental health stigma. I think this might be especially so for men who kind of have to are pressured to live up to certain masculinities and be a quote-unquote tough guy. And I'm wondering, when it comes to digital mental health interventions, what do they bring in particular in terms of overcoming that stigma or addressing that stigma? That could be any intervention.
Is this recorded? I think I'm almost at the point where I think that stigma is bullshit. I really do. The more I deal with community, the more I witness what is happening on the ground. I think it's very easy for us to blame stigma, because then it takes the responsibility off us and it puts it on the man's shoulders, and it suggests that he hasn't grappled with something and that's why he doesn't feel, rather than actually our resources aren't reaching him. They aren't provided in a way that he wants to engage with. And so if stigma in that instance is going to be the barrier, I don't see that going anywhere. There is naturally always going to be, you know, an internal self-doubt and this concern about coming off in a certain way. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. That it's, you know, it's not weak to speak. Everyone loves to use that type of language. But I just think that what that means is that guys don't get engaged with in a way that goes, if you want to speak in this way, if you want to grunt at me in therapy, which often happens, if you want to describe, you know, I often tell this anecdote that I was doing some couples counselling and the wife goes to me, he's never vulnerable with me. There's no vulnerability. I can't seem to get any emotional communication out of him. I come home and I talk to him for half an hour about everything that happened to me. And I say, so, and what does he do? And she goes, he just says, you know, I say, how was your day? And he goes, shit. And I'm like, well, he told you everything you need to know in 30 seconds. And she has this idea that vulnerability and emotion needs to look a certain way. And he has given you an in, and you shut it down. And so I think we need to do the same thing with digital interventions, which is that it doesn't need to look and feel the same way as what this heavy, full-on, complex mental health dialogue has been for so long. I think we need to go, as I said, go up to guys and go, when you're in a time of crisis, what are you looking for? What's that little pick-me-up that's going to get to you? So I think certain elements of stigma are just an innate human response to feeling down, to feeling despair, to feeling like you can't, you know, act in the way that you wish you could. And in fact, what we want to do is provide resources for guys that they want to lean into in those moments.
It's an important point that you bring up, Zach, and it's that the onus really is on us to be responsive to men's needs and wants and be there where they're at, rather than creating something and saying, well, something's wrong with you because you're not here using our service or resources.
I like the idea too of having like a continuum of services, so like meeting people where they're at, and maybe what works for one person might not work for the other person. And I think we talked about those opportunities with digital mental health interventions, and that suite of interventions really is limitless. So lots of opportunities. But I realize it is 6:50 just about. So before we get into our question period, I figured maybe we can just go around and everyone can share one key takeaway about digital interventions for mental health for men. What's one thing you want to leave the audience with before we go to questions?
I'm not really sure. I think maybe I'll focus on the shareability. Getting back to how we play a role in supporting people in our lives. We may be fine. We may never need these resources that we're talking about. We might, but undoubtedly there is somebody in our life that we know, in this moment in fact, that could probably use it. And to be able to share that. And that's so important, because you could have the world's best resource, but if you don't know about it, you'll never be able to benefit from it. And we can only do so much. We rely on you to be able to share that. So we'll keep putting in the effort, but in order to maximize the potential, we each have to be able to be attuned to the people in our life and want to make ourselves available. Even if that means just saying, hey Jim, came across this site, looks pretty cool, you should check it out.
I think the original idea around the digital space, especially from a funding perspective, was that you needed really big budgets to get things up and running with digital assets and these sorts of things. And I think if COVID has shown us anything, is that There's ways, cheaper ways, easy ways of integrating digital mediums that can be super helpful. I was in conversation with a couple of men's groups that were doing great work, but they were largely face-to-face. And Zoom has created, a lot of opportunity. It changes the dynamic a little bit of how those things work. But I think in terms of barriers to access digital resources, those are getting more and more manageable, that even these grassroots groups are starting to engage in online settings.
I think for me, I would say just digital assets and resources in general just open up a lot of different ways on how to connect with different types of entities as well. So for instance, the work that we do, whether it's social media posts, whether it's website, whether it's giving a blog post, just different people are going to connect differently in that sense. And I think just being aware of that and being able to provide a lot of different sources has been a key in the work that we can do.
Awesome. I love all of these thoughts. I think that partnership is my word of the week. Obviously, we're here all as partners, which is the best part about something like this event. And we often talk in November of health by stealth, the Trojan horse. You want to come in, you want to surprise everyone, and leave them. Oh my God, mental health! I didn't see that coming. And that's kind of what we're aiming for. And we're realizing more and more that because November is now known for this type of stuff, we actually can't get into the room and surprise anyone necessarily. And so Reddit is the perfect example that I think of, which is a resource that was never created as a mental health resource. There are so many out there. I was in a meeting with Bumble last week, and they said the amount of guys who are reaching out to women for support, not a date, because it's the space where they are, it's the space where they can try and connect. So I think that we need to understand who we can partner with that want to reach men, that have men who are experiencing mental health difficulties, and rather than go, oh, we're going to create another website on our own. Heads up guys, rocked up at a great time and succeeded, but I don't think many more are going to. And so what we want to do is to create a partner where we can say, we have the understanding, we have the resources, you have huge traffic, can we now join forces and make sure that when they're coming, they're getting the stuff that they need.
Amazing. If I can plug my study one more time. I would say my main takeaway would be around scale up and equity. So for the scale up piece, really excited and inspired by how much digital interventions have taken off in the past few years, and also inspired by the funding and the government and nonprofit buy-in for these interventions. But some of my work has also shown that despite interventions being available, people are still some people are still not accessing them to the degree that we might hope. And for me, this really speaks to the need to continue thinking about equity, continue thinking about who's not getting the support that they might need, whether that's because of technology barriers, not having a phone. And the list goes on. So I think I'm jazzed that these resources are available, and I think there's so much opportunity, but just keeping that good work going in an inclusive way. And with that, I think we can open it up to questions. So I haven't checked my phone in a bit. I'm getting a shake of the head. I don't think we've got any bites on YouTube.
Hey.
We have some hands in the room though. So I saw Michael first, and then maybe Kristen, do you have your hand up?
Yep, yeah, I do, but you go first.
Do I need a mic or can I just?
We got you.
Okay.
Speak up though.
We've heard a bit about websites and online training courses and things like that tonight, but I think one word that hasn't been mentioned is TikTok. I'm particularly talking about youth mental health. We know that, I don't know what the stat is, but ridiculous portions of young people are using TikTok and getting mental health resources and education and literacy from TikTok. So I wonder if you guys can talk a bit about how TikTok can be used for good in mental health promotion, when you know a lot of what we hear about it is that it's scary and bad.
I can answer. We actually tried to do the TikTok, the Google, the Facebook. But it didn't catch on for us. And I suspect that perhaps we didn't have enough sort of effort and resources to do. All this stuff actually takes a lot of work. You know, you may see 30-second clips, but that 30-second clip takes a lot of effort. So we actually had the guy who looks after our social media, Joel Robeson, does a fantastic job across the platforms. He's a professional graphic designer. He helped us do it. We got a volunteer, this young woman who was so enthused about TikTok, wanted to help us. So we had our other staff involved. So we put a lot of effort into it, but we clearly missed the mark. It didn't catch on. It doesn't mean it can't work and it won't work, but it's not something that will happen automatically. You do really need to invest a lot of time and resources, to be honest, to capitalize on them.
So if you're going to get any buying on TikTok, you need to be putting up a video a day, pretty much. And one thing that we do at Movember, which again comes down to partnership, is influencer work. Suggesting that Movember's TikTok is actually going to reach, we may be big, but we still are not going to get cut through. And so you want to partner with the people who are, and we can talk about all of the assholes who are on TikTok, but the best way to break them down is to rise up new voices. And so finding those equity voices, finding Indigenous voices, finding guys from the LGBTQIA community and who have a large base, and going in again with your resources, and we did this in the UK, where we bring in 5 YouTube influencers, we talk to them about what works, what type of language to use. Don't change your language per se, don't say commit when we're talking about suicide, for instance. We just give them basic literacy, and we give them creative license. There's risk in that, but there's also so much opportunity because they've got millions of followers, and suddenly they've got a member badge at the end of their video, and people go, what's that? Where did that come from? And so it is a matter of joining forces with people who are experts in this, really Gen Z, really, and not pretending that we are the people who are going to be about to read it. That's the way. No offense, John.
I would echo that really quick. I would just say partnerships. I love that term here because I do think that whether it's with Gen Z or just organizations themselves, because we try to dabble in it as well, and it's whether the Buddy Up campaign or other work we do, and there's a lot of resources that are hard. I think with suicide in particular, with suicide prevention, it's moderation of pieces as well. Who's being moderating the comments and how do you do all that work? But if there's a few organizations, few groups of people who are doing this stuff, we can partner up, whether it's with influencers or together, there's so many opportunity for that.
I can add too. I love the reach of things like TikTok or other social media. I love the grassroots aspects of it too. So recognizing that not all digital interventions need to come from researchers or health organizations, but can just come from anyone. So many folks on TikTok with the influencers will say, and everyone really, who are really just bringing mental health into the conversation and opening up about it. I know we talked about stigma, but destigmatizing or at least normalizing mental health too. So I think that work being done is great and something that we spoke to. Yeah, we'll go to Krista, and then at the back we'll come to you next.
Oh, yeah, sure. I was just going to say thank you for all of your comments. Really interesting conversation. I was just thinking too, I think a lot of what we've talked about tonight has been a preventative focus. And I wonder what your thoughts are on whether there's a place for digital interventions in the crisis end. Because I think sometimes, whilst preventative resources and interventions can make a small difference for many, when you're in that crisis situation and you're navigating as a support or a man themselves, where there's very limited resources, a big burden already placed on our emergency systems and things, I just wonder whether that could be a space that we haven't quite entered into that could make a significant impact for one person versus many. But yeah, what do you guys think? And
that's awesome. That's a great thought. And we see so many studies with like Fitbit, and breathing exercises and trying to help people when they're in a state of panic, for instance. I do agree, and that's a constant conundrum for us, which is, do you want to reach 12 people who are at severe risk, or do you want to reach 10,000 people who probably didn't need to hear from you? And that's, I think, constantly in the mental health game, really something to grapple with. But when it comes down to suicide risk, I don't know how you're ever going to get a study through ethics that offers something that is digital, because the literal risk that is there trying to go, all right, go and watch some videos, we'll provide some clear safety behaviours, and we can use anything from CBT or DBT to try to reduce what is taking place in the moment. But you're going to want someone there with them to make sure that they don't harm themselves. So I think it's a matter of threshold. It's like, where can we get to safely, which is still severe enough, and we can start to see, and that's what's going to lead to people going, oh, actually, because we know, and I'm sure it happens in BC as well, if you get someone to intervene, it's often going to be police, and that is just going to aggravate the situation. And it leads to some pretty horrific outcomes in many instances. And it also means that when someone goes through a crisis again, they don't call. So if we want to make sure that they are actually going to reach out in those moments, because it's often, the greatest risk for suicide death is a suicide attempt. Yeah? So we want to make sure that if you have had an attempt, you are willing to re-engage with services in the future.
Yeah, it is a tough one. Like on Heads Up Guys, we have one section, most of it is for men themselves, and we talk about in a crisis, sometimes shit hits the fan. And we want guys to know that even if that happens, here's what you can do. And we try to arm them, prepare them for that possibility. And in the same way for our friends and family section, the guy that you may be supporting, sometimes he may find himself in a crisis situation. Here's what you can do. They may never need to utilize that knowledge and information and skills that we're trying to impart, but it's better to be prepared than not knowing what to do at all.
I would add to maybe thinking about these more intensive digital mental health services as like a replacement to in-person supports, but as like an adjuvant or complement, or standalone in some cases. And I'm thinking back to my work at like BC Children's Hospital and like inpatient mental health units. And a lot of that was before COVID, but even then we were using like digital interventions so that we could get people discharged sooner, back at home sooner, especially if you're not living in Vancouver or in northern BC on the island or wherever else. So I think we can get creative in terms of bundling that with existing services and also leveraging it, recognizing digital services are easier for some people and more accessible in certain settings too. But not a replacement always, for sure. And I think there was a question at the very back in the purple.
Hello. Yep. I saw a talk maybe a couple of weeks ago from an entrepreneur called Uriel Lee, and you may or may not know who he is, but he's a serial entrepreneur who probably most famously created Waves. So I think you probably use that in your everyday life. Anyway, what he had to say about scaling successful digital products was that he said there's a few different ingredients of them, and one of them viably is this kind of thing called a product market fit. And a product market fit is essentially if you have a target consumer base, and the threshold that he said in terms of anything he's scaled is that 40% of the target consumers say that they would be very disappointed if your solution didn't exist in the market because it's solving a problem for them per se. Right, so that really struck with me to think about the millions of digital interventions and apps that are out there and how you get that critical mass of getting that product market fit in the first place. And then some of the other stuff that you've talked about around, I guess, what you call reach and amplification through partnerships, because I think, here we rightly so are very focused on being evidence-based, so it needs to work. But then we also need to think about efficacy, and efficacy happens through product market fit and also amplification. So I guess what I'm thinking about is, are the products we're putting up here, as well as being evidence-based, do they have the right level of product market fit in clarity? And then secondly, if we think about partnerships, how do we really get that clarity of scale? Who's the dream partnership combination? I don't come from an academic world, I come from a business world. So I sit there and think, okay, so if we've got this thing that's really efficacious, how do you get that degree of product market fit and scale? What's the dream cartel of partners who can push this through? Because you just want to make it scale significantly in the world. So that's a pretty broad question, but I'm really interested in your products and how you're thinking about that.
Look, guys, if you were to think of blue sky, what would you like for?
Well, I couldn't quite hear everything. I heard partnerships, and I love that's your word of the week. It should be the operative word for all of us. And I'm looking at you, Zach. We've been partnering from an academic perspective for a long time. We also work with Movember, and it seems like an obvious partnership that's just sitting there waiting for us to do something about. What that actually looks like, I don't know. That's what conversation's about. But absolutely, I think recognizing how we complement one another, not just us, there's many digital resources out there to create something that's comprehensive, gets at the broad range of men that we need to reach, but also understanding there's no, even as a conglomerate, if you will, we can't be everything for everyone. And I think that we need to think carefully about as well.
And I think I heard most of that, so I can try to repeat some of what was maybe missed, but thanks so much for starting us off. And I think it was around, like, when we have a really good, really effective digital mental health intervention, and it's evidence-based, we know it works, how can we get that into the market? So how can we have the product market fit so that it's actually taken up in practice and is competitive and accessible for folks? And I don't have a great answer to that, but wondering if our other panelists do. It's a tough one for sure.
I think that it's also, Michelle, getting that on the radar of academia. I think that this whole notion of we've created this thing and now that's enough has really limited us full stop. And I think a partnership between us, John, is lovely. Let's blossom this from here. But I do think that we are still a health organisation, and I think what Michelle is talking about is the corporate world, and not just asking for philanthropy, which is only going to again give you so much reach, but rather they have access to a different market, and they will also hopefully provide you with a different platform and a different channel through which people can view these types of interventions. But I don't know if what that TED Talk or whatever it was, Michelle, around whether or not, if there is not that product viability and you don't reach that 40% threshold, should you cease to exist? And I think that is something that people need to grapple with. Should you just, and no one seems to do that in this space. And I think that is something that is hard, but remember, we're working towards not existing. Like, that is the aim, and that should be everyone's aim. And when you get to the point where your thing is not being picked up, maybe it's time to move onto something else. And I think that we as academics as well, we hang our flag and we say, this is the hill that I will die on. And it kind of is just a bit of a waste of time and energy, I think, sometimes, when it's like, it's not reaching that level that is enough. But it's not every day you stumble upon something that gets you 50,000 active users all the time. But I think that we need to be schooled, and maybe it is going to having business partners and making sure that is something that is within our education as well as academics.
That speaks to a lot of what I was going to say as well. I think for me, when it comes down to collaboration, partnerships, and seeing I think it's important to see them win, but then I also personally feel that collaboration has almost turned into a bit of a buzzword. And to me, it's about, okay, if we, for instance, we're a nonprofit and we're going to partner with other agencies, whether it's academia, whether it's other health organizations, I think it's important really, first of all, these organizations really get together and say, like, what are we trying to achieve here and what is the win for all of us here? And I think being able to sort of think that way and create some sort of terms of reference on what we're all trying to accomplish, I think will hopefully lead to better success with collaboration rather than just saying we're collaborating in that sense. I find that a lot of the times in the work that we do in our space sometimes. And I think to me the other piece too is, right, like how do we partner up and how do we go in sort of as a unit rather than separate distinct entities there. And we find that all the time there, with Buddy Up, a lot of the work that we do is with companies and organizations, and we tell them, hey, bring in this campaign, it's going to help you raise awareness, break down stigma. But then there's been 8 other organizations that have approached them around mental health just within the last year. So I think there's a lot of opportunity out there to work together and package things up a little bit better and not overwhelm the community out there as well. And yeah, that's just sort of my take on partnerships.
There's also another overarching campaign which is required, which is that I don't think there is much of a community where many digital interventions, for instance, where 40% of the community are going to go, oh no, please don't take it, because many of them are not even going to know about it or care. And I think that's because there is not enough preemptive help seeking, full stop. It's not seen as something that is essential in their day-to-day lives. If you said to them, we're going to take away ambulances, or we're going to take away something that is seen as critical in their day-to-day functioning, and I think that that's maybe what we're missing, is that we're not selling ourselves as critical to them, and that's what we need to be seeking. Is you we're not positioning ourselves as something that is really important to you, and this is why you need to integrate this into your day-to-day, rather than, we use language like this again in academia as adjunct, and where something you can pick and choose, but it's like, no, we want to be in your pocket like Uber. We want to be there all the time, every day, to be providing you with feedback.
My 2 cents from like a more research side is like, we often think about knowledge translation, so thinking about what we learn from our research and bridging that into practice and having it in your pocket, as you said. And I think one thing that researchers can do better is start to think about issues like product market fit from the get-go. So instead of thinking like after your intervention's built, after it's designed, now how are we going to get it to people, like really think of that from the very beginning and think about like, is this what's wanted? Is this what's needed? Are there other interventions that are competitive, and who's going to use it in what context and things like that? So really thinking from the get-go rather than after the fact. Yeah, I think I saw Calvin before, and then we'll go to you next.
Yes, so I have a question. I'm just thinking,
I'll just bring you a mic really quick, Calvin.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, for like in cases in countries like Canada, Australia, the US, a lot of BIPOC men, their mental health issues are a little bit more complicated, and obviously English isn't their first language. But a lot of these platforms, what I've noticed is that it's only mostly available in English, the resources that's available. So I'm just wondering, like, as people working on these platforms, what kind of strategies are you taking to sort of make it more inclusive and more culturally responsive so that more people can actually access these resources? Because right now most of it's in English, and for a lot of BIPOC, English isn't the first language.
Well, I can say for Heads Up Guys, we've been approached many times about translating into other languages. And what I tell people, it's not just translating the website. That's the core of the resource, but the social media is also critical for engagement. And there's resources to do the translation, the static text, but then there needs to be life beyond that. It is a dynamic resource, both in terms of us constantly adding and updating the content of the site, but also from the social media perspective about engaging with the community. And that's where it always falls apart. People say, well, we can bring some money and translate it, but then it just dies. We can't manage that. And then what I've learned over time is that it's really expensive to run these resources. So, you know, we were talking about, you know, researchers will come and build stuff and it can be really cool, but never give any thought to what life is like after a grant ends. That's when it gets really hard. So for us, we're not opposed whatsoever to translating the site and being more culturally responsive, but it costs money, and without partners coming to the table with those resources, with the long-term commitment, it just won't happen.
David, with Buddy Up, if I can add, we have it in English and French, and we've also been approached as well in can we translate it. But I think another piece that we have to a lot of the times think about as well is going back to the cultural context of what we are translating and what it's going to sound like once you finish translating it as well, right? So for instance, we can go ahead and translate something to a different language. For instance, one of our staffs are having a conversation is asking the question directly, are you thinking about suicide? Right? That can be translated in a lot of different languages, but how is that going to go when it's just purely translated in a different country, for instance, in a different community, different cultural context? So I think it's, when translation's on the table, it's more than just translation, but also looking at basically ground zero when it comes down to building it up once again and then you're going going.
And I think it's important that men see themselves and that they're reflected in the intervention as well. And speaking to the Buddy Up campaign and some evaluation work we did, one of the pieces that a lot of the men really appreciated was the different characters. They represent different men, different age groups, different cultures, different backgrounds, and being able to see themselves reflected in content made it more relatable. Just like Zach was talking about earlier around adapting the program culturally. I guess a specific example of that, in an intervention that we were designing, we were looking for just typical images, we were making metaphors of taking care of your truck the way you would take care of your health, right? Looking under the hood, these sorts of things. And one of the images that we pilot tested happened to be a European style bakery, not a Canadian style. And this completely turned the guys off as they said, oh, well, this content's not designed for me, therefore it's not appropriate to me because the imagery didn't fit.
Great answers there. I think we'll go to the next question because I'm aware of the time and I want everyone to get out of here on time. But I think it was at the right table here.
I just wanted to keep picking at the thread that was started in the conversation about TikTok and scale. These are great evidence-based interventions, especially the upstream. Like, how do you address or counter the risks of falling down other rabbit holes with potential interventions that are, I would say, harmful?
So preventing getting interventions out there that we know are harmful, or more that there are?
Just that there are things online that are not necessarily helpful. So how do you address it or counter
And
that?
for sure. And they're far more interesting, it seems, as well, for some reason. Because, of course, they want to take these vitamins that have no evidence base. But I think that the key is there again. I really do believe that it's an education process, and if you can bring people in, the influencers who are having much of this influence, and tell them about, because largely it comes down to illiteracy, and not the fact that they can't read, but the fact that they don't have science education. And so I think our aim is to, rather than necessarily always talking to the common guy out there, it is knowing where they are getting their and consuming their health information, and then not getting it from the government. And COVID really fucked with that, because there was a huge anti-science movement And that is what has led everyone onto these platforms, really, and especially men. And I think that is what we're seeing right now is that the 15 to 25-year-old men, the majority of them are getting their health information from non-health entities. And so that's a very tricky situation where if they start to smell any form of government and or university affiliation, they tend to turn off. So we need to get sneaky and infiltrate. And really, again, it's help ourselves. It's how can we adapt things? How can we find partners that are going to be able to provide information in a language that is going to actually infiltrate that dialogue? And really providing unique ways. Again, it's getting out of our own frame. And I think we get in our own way too much in academia as purists. And I've always taken an extremely pragmatic view to things, which is that I don't want to create anything that no one is going to read and look at. I don't want to just sit there and make something that's just going to collect dust. That doesn't interest me, and I think should not interest any of us. We should be creating things that are going to actually reach those who are seeking it, and that means putting aside some hectic ethical values sometimes, and rather going, the example that I always use is in therapy. If a boy comes in and he says something that's not politically correct in the first session, if I jump on him, if I police him, he's gone. He's immediately gone. But if I wait until the third or fourth session when he trusts me and there's respect, then we can actually form something, some form of bond of therapeutic alliance that allows for him to adapt and grow and realise that saying that misogynistic thing wasn't in his best interest. But if we do it immediately, we lose them. So we need to be willing to swallow some of that and to just go, okay, we're going to adapt to their language and their place, and be willing to put ourselves on the line and take a bit of risk.
Any other last minute thoughts on that?
Good answers, Aaron.
Thank you for taking that one.
But I think the only thing I'd say is it goes back to working together, though, and it's like, I think if we can combine some of our existing efforts and have a stronger voice, maybe that's one way to deflect some of the other maybe negativity that's out there as well.
Yeah, and I think too, thinking about that harmful or ineffective or wrong content that's out there, however you want to frame it, depending on the content, I think it also ties into a broader conversation about what's out there in media and in social media, and whether it's attacks on reproductive rights, anti-trans speech, white supremacist speech. There's a lot of harm out there and a lot of bad messaging, we'll say the least. So yeah, I don't have any answers, whether it's education or censorship or accountability measures. I think that's a whole other conversation, but definitely good to be thinking about it and being creative moving forward for sure. And on that heavier note, I think we will wrap up tonight. And I just want to say on behalf of the UBC Reducing Male Suicide Cluster, thank you so much to everyone for being here, and thank you all for the really tricky but engaging questions. And of course, a huge thanks to our panelists. Couldn't have done it without you. So John, Paul, Akash, and Zach. Round of applause for these four, please.
Thanks everyone for coming.
And if you'd like to help inform the next generation of digital health interventions, we're currently starting a study right now looking at men's peer support and social connections for mental health challenges. So there's some cards on the table, but if you are interested, we'd love to hear from you.
You should have one in September. This meeting, September, because that's when you're at the headquarters of everything. So September, fall, winter, it should happen again. Another round.
John will fly me out.
Whether it's Facebook, Twitter, follow the UBC Reducing Male Suicide Cluster. Little plug there. I'm sure we will have events in the fall, or at least in the school year to come. So yeah, definitely check.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone.